Many of you know that I do a lot of DIY. I love DIY. And I really like always having a project on the go, building something or changing something, taking something apart and turning it into something new. In fact, all around this room, even although you can't see it on the camera, there's like pieces of wood and paint and things for the next DIY project. And one of the essentials in life for me are things which take measurements. So, measuring tape. Now, measuring tape is covered in all kinds of dirt and paint and goodness knows what. It's been used so often. Set squares and rulers to get angles and measurements right. My other little flexible measuring tape for sewing. Things which take measurements, to me, are really an important part of my life. Projects need measurements. And for the last few weeks, we've been thinking about God's people working on their project. Builders rebuilding the temple, rebuilding the altar of God, and then the temple as a whole. And we've seen that this building project wasn't just about making a new physical building, although they were building a physical building. It reflected what was going on in the lives of God's people spiritually. They had been taken into exile because they had turned away from God. And in returning from exile in Babylon, they learned again that they are God's people, that God cares for his people, and that God loves them. And out of this crisis of being taken into exile unexpectedly, they get a new awareness of who they are as God's people. And yes, they continue to mess up, they continue to do things wrong, but God is committed to his people and to building his kingdom. One of the prophets at the time that we're thinking about was a man called Zechariah, and he had a number of visions from God. And here's what he saw in part of his first vision. This is what the Lord says: I will return to Jerusalem with mercy, and there my house will be rebuilt, and the measuring line will be stretched over Jerusalem, declares the Lord Almighty. I am with my people, says God. I will return them to the place where I promised my presence would be, to Jerusalem. And my dwelling place will be rebuilt. Let's get out the measuring line and make the plans. And all this comes in the middle of Zechariah's first vision, when he sees a picture of God sending angels throughout the world to report back on how things are, the state of the world. And then later after this, there's a picture of craftsmen who have the power to bring down nations. It's kind of weird stuff, it's great. For the last couple of weeks, we've heard from the prophet Haggai. Haggai, straight to the point sort of guy, one issue, building the house of the Lord, and he would say it straight up to the people in his little sermons. Zechariah, on the other hand, he was a man of visions. Incredible and weird pictures of God at work in his world, with poems which explain the visions. And I read a book this week which said almost nothing is obvious in Zechariah. It's like abstract art. And if Haggai was a builder or an engineer, Zechariah was a poet or an artist, adding colour to what Haggai was saying. They prophesied around the same time, Haggai first, followed a few months later by Zechariah. And they're often mentioned together, for example, in the book of Ezra that we've been looking at. And they both want to see God glorified. They both want to see God's presence revealed to his people. But their tone, their style is completely different from one another. I sort of imagine Haggai in the middle of a group of people ordering them around. Gather timber, start working, do this, do that. Whereas Zechariah, I kind of imagine half asleep a lot of the time, dreaming great dreams about God. Both of these kinds of people are important, and God works through both of them. And actually the first sort of 6 chapters of Zechariah are a series of visions which Zechariah saw when he was asleep. And the passage that we're going to look at today ends with the words, "Be still before the Lord, all mankind, because he has roused himself from his holy dwelling." And this could be the verse which sums up what Zechariah is saying in kind of the first 2/3 of the book. God is on the move. Remember last week we thought about God shaking things up. Here today we have another picture of God in action, moving, involved with his people. God has purposes which are being worked out in the world, and God will act for those purposes to come about. And the life of God's people in the past, in the present, and in the future sit with God's purposes for the world. Because God is creating a kingdom. God is building a kingdom, and it's his kingdom, not empires which rise and fall. It's his kingdom, which is an everlasting kingdom. And we see that in places like Psalms. Psalm 145 says, "All your works praise you, Lord. Your faithful people extol you. They tell the glory of your kingdom. They speak of your might, so that all people may know your mighty acts and the glorious splendour of your kingdom. Your kingdom is an everlasting kingdom. Your dominion endures through all generations." God is in the business of building something enduring, something which will last. And he calls his people, us, to be part of that building. Praising God for what he's doing, telling people about this kingdom that God's bringing about. And Zechariah, he has visions of that building work. And very often these visions come, like I said, when he's asleep, sort of half asleep. Zechariah's sleepy visions are something which look with hope to the future. The temple's barely started to be built. The walls of Jerusalem are still a heap of rubble. But here's what Zechariah saw in his sleep.
Then I looked up, and there before me was a man with a measuring line in his hand. I asked, "Where are you going?" He answered me, "To measure Jerusalem, to find out how wide and how long it is." While the angel who was speaking to me was leaving, another angel came to meet him and said to him, "Run, tell that young man Jerusalem will be a city without walls because of the great number of people and animals in it. And I myself will be a wall of fire around it, declares the Lord, and I will be its glory within. Come, come. Flee from the land of the north, declares the Lord, for I have scattered you to the four winds of the heaven, declares the Lord. Come, Zion, escape you who live in daughter Babylon. For this is what the Lord Almighty says. After the glorious one has sent me against the nations that have plundered you, for whoever touches you touches the apple of his eye. I will surely raise my hand against them, so that their slaves will plunder them. Then you will know that the Lord Almighty has sent me. Shout and be glad, daughter Zion, for I am coming, and I will live among you, declares the Lord. Many nations will be joined with the Lord in that day and will become my people. I will live among you, and you will know that the Lord Almighty has sent me to you. The Lord will inherit Judah as his portion in the Holy Land, and will again choose Jerusalem. Be still before the Lord, all mankind, because he has roused himself from his holy dwelling.
I'm not sure about you, but I'm not the best sleeper in the whole world. It takes me ages to get over to sleep. Once I'm asleep, I don't dream, or at least I don't remember dreams. But when I wake up in the morning, and I'm really, really rubbish in the morning, when I wake up in the morning, I quite often have these kind of half awake, half asleep, really vivid imaginings. Prophet Zechariah, he's a pretty poor sleeper as well, or at least some of the time. Because this passage that we're looking at today comes from a section of Zechariah which begins During the night, I had a vision. In that half asleep, half awake time, Zechariah is granted sights and pictures from God, a vision from God, which shows him some of God's ways and God's purposes in his world and for his people. And what we've read today is the third of those visions, and then a little bit of poetry, I guess, to respond to those visions. And as we've thought about building and working with Haggai, so we're going to think about what these visions of Zechariah tell us about God. It's not really about us, it's about God. The first thing Zechariah sees is a vision of God's city. But this vision begins with a man. And so it starts, "Then I looked up, and there before me was a man with a measuring line in his hand. I asked, 'Where are you going?' He answered me, 'To measure Jerusalem and find out how wide and long it is.'" This man's a surveyor. Building work is underway on the temple, but it's not the only part of Jerusalem which lies in ruins. The whole city is in ruins. The walls of the city, which are such an important part of an ancient city, are crumbled, and in ruins are heaps of rubble. And so here we have a picture of someone setting out to survey the damage, measure the dimensions, I guess, and to prepare to rebuild. He's not an angel. This isn't a vision of heavenly action. He's a man setting out to do the preparation work for a building project. It represents the ways of humanity. And there's faith with this man. This is someone who's caught the vision. This is someone who sees the importance of rebuilding God's city. But his vision isn't for God's temple, it's for walls. It's for protection around the city. And I guess his thinking might be something along the lines of, well, why work hard on building God's temple when actually the city is unprotected, it's vulnerable to attack? We need to protect ourselves in the way we did before. Walls are needed. We need to rebuild these walls. We need our walls back. And it's not crazy thinking. For a group of people whose parents and grandparents suffered attack and siege in that city, protecting themselves would seem like an essential thing to do. They might even, in their minds, consider it a godly thing to do. God's temple that we're working on needs protecting. And so God's city walls need rebuilding. That's what we had before. So let's measure it out and let's replace what was destroyed. Can you imagine the conversations in Jerusalem at this time? I think are similar to the kind of conversations that we're having these days. I can't wait till the walls are built. I can't wait till things get back to normal. I can't wait till the things are the same as they were before. And all our efforts and all our vision and all our resources go into building something that is exactly the same as it was before. Rebuilding Jerusalem to exactly the same pattern with exactly the same measurements. There's no thought here of building something new. There's no thought of a Jerusalem that might be expanded and transformed by God. What Zechariah sees is a practical man, a man who relies on what he's seen in the past as a template for the future. And that is absolutely realistic and absolutely down to earth. It's understandable. But it leaves no room for God to be at work, for God to be doing something bigger than what he's done in the past. The man with the measuring line is interested in dimensions. That's why he has a measuring line. He's interested in creating something that's constrained by the measurements of the past. Let's rebuild what's been lost to the millimetre. And maybe we can be like that. Maybe as we move through lockdown and as we plan for the future and how we come out of lockdown, we want to recreate the past. The things that have been lost for the last 6 or 7 months, we want to recreate to the millimetre. But what if God wants us to throw away the measuring stick? Because in Zechariah's vision, God intervenes with the measuring. So he says, while the angel who was speaking to me was leaving, another angel came to meet him and said to him, "Run and tell that young man, Jerusalem will be a city without walls because of the great number of people and animals in it." God's purposes for his city is not that it is constrained and built by human walls. Instead, it's a place that bursts out of the limits of the past. Its people aren't gathered together behind walls, hidden and cut off from the outside. It's a city that's open. Everyone, anyone can see what's going on there. The people can come and go and spread out from the city into the surrounding landscape. This is a picture of a new openness for God's people. It doesn't mean that this rebuilt city won't have boundaries. It means that the boundaries might be in different places to where the people had imagined. Years before, the prophet Isaiah saw a vision of Zion, of Jerusalem, and he saw the city had a cornerstone, something which provides a foundation, marks out an edge, a dimension for the city. And he says, this is what the sovereign Lord says, "See, I lay a stone in Zion, a tested stone, a precious cornerstone for a sure foundation. The one who relies on it will never be stricken with panic. I will make justice the measuring line and righteousness the plumb line." That's the things God is interested in measuring, justice and righteousness. These are the things which should mark out God's city and provide dimensions, if you like, to God's city. God's people must work to build a city, to build God's place to those kind of measurements, the measurements of justice and righteousness. As well as the cornerstone that Isaiah saw, Zechariah does see walls around the city, but not built by human endeavour. It's walls built by God. "I myself will be a wall of fire around it, declares the Lord, and I will be its glory within." In the Bible, God's presence is often described like fire. When the people came out of Egypt, they were led by a pillar of fire which protected them from the Egyptian army. The protection of this city isn't the human walls, isn't the human constructs. The protection of this city is God himself dwelling with his people. God's presence, though, isn't just a fire around the city, it's also his glory within the city. "I myself will be a wall of fire around it, and I will be its glory within," declares the Lord. There's a light in the city that God's building, and it doesn't come from candles or lights in every window. This city glows with the light of God, and that's one of the ways that the Bible understands God's glorious presence. Hundreds of years later, the Apostle John has the same kind of vision as Zechariah, seeing a new picture of Jerusalem, and he says, "The city does not need the sun or the moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives it light, and the Lamb is its lamp. The nations will walk by its light, and the kings of the earth will bring their splendour into it. On no day will its gates ever be shut, for there will be no night there." I think in a world where darkness seems to rule, God is building a city where his light will shine and illuminate the world around it. The light comes from him, from his glory and his presence. Glory, though, when the Bible talks about it, is not just about light, it's also about honour. When we glorify someone or something, we give it honour, we give it esteem, I suppose. The honour or the reputation of this city that's been built is founded on God's presence. Not on the heights of the walls, not on the splendour of the buildings, not on how wealthy or how important the people are who live in it. It is founded on the presence of God. And we are God's people. We are being built into his community. Do we find our honour in pointing to God, to directing others to light? Or actually, do we try and find honour and esteem by other measurements, by wealth, by status? This is the challenge of Zechariah's vision. The second half of our passage today isn't so much a vision as two poems which respond to the vision, and they both start with instructions to Zion. Come and behold, or shout. And they both end with Zechariah saying, then you will know that God Almighty has sent me. Then you'll know that what you are hearing here or reading here is trustworthy, that what I'm saying is from God. First poem is all about God's loving protection of his people. There's a cry of urgency. Come, come, people. It's not an invitation. It's a command. Get up, get going. Come from where you're far from God to a place where you can experience his presence and his care. And the word that's translated as come in this passage is translated in other contexts as woe. This is an urgent call to leave behind the places and the people where people have been scattered far away from God and to come near to him. A lot of people stayed in Babylon when the first people returned to the land. Maybe they stayed because they had got comfortable in Babylon. Maybe they had got comfortable in a place which was far from God. That isn't our home. That isn't where home should be. And God urgently calls his people home. Come back to my city, he says. Come back to my place. Why? Well, because God is going to judge these nations which have plundered and destroyed his people. For this is what the Lord Almighty says. After the glorious one has sent me against the nations that have plundered you, for whoever touches you touches the apple of his eye, I will surely raise my hand against them, so that their slaves will plunder them. Then you will know that the Lord Almighty has sent me. The nations which brought down Judah, which plundered them of people and of land, are going in turn to be plundered by God. It's what goes around comes around, I suppose. And he doesn't say this because he says this because the people mean something to him. You, we, the people, are the apple of God's eye. Such a lovely term of endearment, something that's come from the Bible into general use, I suppose, in English. It describes love. It describes the value that we have for someone that we see. And it echoes God's loving protection of his people right from the very beginning. Deuteronomy 32, we've got part of Moses' song of praise to God, describing God's relationship with his people. And this is what Moses sings. In a desert land he found him, in a barren and howling waste. He shielded him and cared for him. He guarded him as the apple of his eye. He guarded him as the apple of his eye. Isn't that such a lovely phrase? His people might be punished for turning away from God, but ultimately, God lovingly protects his people because they are the apple of his eye. He cares for them. He cares for us because we are the apple of his eye. Those who stand against God's people, says Zechariah, stand against God himself. And this first poem emphasises what Zechariah has seen in his vision, a God who lovingly protects and cares for his people. Second poem is all about God's presence. Shout and be glad, daughter Zion, for I am coming and I will live among you, declares the Lord. Shout, be glad, sing and rejoice, I suppose you could say. Make a noise, raise your voice in joyful praise to God. Why? Because I'm coming, says God. Literally, that should be translated, for behold, I come. Behold, look, see. I am coming. I am coming. God is coming in all his glory to take up residence in Jerusalem, coming to be present with his people. And all these people working hard to rebuild God's temple in his city, they have assurance that this is not in vain. Behold, I will come and live among you. Your work is for something. And we've heard this for so many weeks now. This is another reassurance of God's promise of his presence with his people. And the joy is heightened, I guess, by this amazing promise that many nations will be joined with the Lord in that day and will become my people. I will live among you, and you will know that the Lord Almighty has sent me to you. There's joy and celebration, not just for God's people, but for the world, as nations are drawn to God. The promise of presence, which was first made to Israel as they became a nation, is now promised to the whole world, and that is worth singing about. God has chosen Jerusalem to be his dwelling place. But he didn't choose Jerusalem with walls and boundaries marked out by human beings. He chose a place where the nations would come and be a city that could experience his presence, the dwelling of God. And God inherits the land of Judah. He makes the land holy by his presence. And he invites the world, the nations, to dwell with him. It's an invitation. It's an invitation for those who don't know God to come and know him. And it's an invitation for those who do know him to realise that God's kingdom is bigger, more expansive than we think it is. And for us to make room to welcome all who come. The last verse of the passage is the one which I said could sum up what Zechariah is all about. Be still before the Lord, all mankind, because he has roused himself from his holy dwelling. Our world is a noisy place. People have got plenty to say about literally everything. As soon as something happens, people are all over Twitter to make a noise about it. But when God acts, when God's power is seen, when God overthrows the ways of the world, the nations that think they will last forever and have so much power, when God declares, I will make my home with my people, the proper response is silence. Silence is a sign of awe at what God is doing. It's the world catching its breath as God acts. This is Zechariah's vision of the future, all mankind silent before the awesome God. It's not something that we can see happening now. God's dismissed by so many people and noisily dismissed by so many people. But it can start with us, recognising the city that God calls his people to build, recognising the power that he shows as he dwells with his people. And our response is silence.